The EB-66 is an uncelebrated part of the story of the Vietnam Air War, but it was an important tactical asset and an essential part of the US war effort. The EB-66 was central to countering Vietnamese surface-to-air missiles, and by 1968 over 100 US fixed-wing aircraft had been lost to SA-2 guidelines in Vietnam. Beyond the obvious threat, the presence of the guidelines forced US aviators to fly lower, exposing them to ground fire, which extracted a heavy toll. Eliminating the SAM sites and radars was a high priority for the US Tactical Air Command, which was already heavily engaged in repelling intense attacks across South Vietnam, a campaign that would eventually become known as the Tet Offensive. As well as locating the Phan Song radars, the EB-66 could jam them, allowing strike packages to get in and out of the layered North Vietnamese defense network. Because of this, the EB-66s were also high priority targets for the Vietnam People's Air Force, who had started to actively hunt for them. They scored a success on January 14th when two MiG-21s had shot down Preview 1, an EB-66C supporting a strike on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Vietnamese ground controllers had learned to look for the familiar elliptical orbit above 30,000 feet that indicated the presence of an EB-66. So unbeknownst to its crew of 7 on this clear afternoon, two MiG-21 Fishbeds flown by two of the VPAF's top pilots, Pham Tran Nang and Nguyen Van Co, had taken off from Noi Bai Air Force Base to intercept it. The MiG-21 entered service with the VPAF in 1966, a fighter and interceptor capable of flying at twice the speed of sound and armed with two infrared homing air-to-air missiles and a 30mm cannon. The MiG-21 was the premier air-to-air fighter of the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact Air Forces in the 1960s. The VPAF didn't have many in their inventory and used them cautiously. In the spring of 1968, only 8 MiG-21s were active. The remainder were stashed on the other side of the Chinese border to protect them from US air power. So the two MiGs flew low, exploiting the ground clutter to conceal themselves. In order to further reduce the chances of detection, they minimized their contact with ground control. The EB-6 was also well able to pick up the distinctive signs of Vietnamese fighter radios, and would likely run for safety at the first sign of trouble. Radars off, the two young Vietnamese pilots scanned the clear sky for their quarry. But as they got close enough to acquire the target visually, the MiG pilots realized that the defenseless EB-66 was not alone. After the loss of Preview 1, the TAC ordered that every EB-66 mission would be protected by a barrier combat air patrol of F-4 Phantoms. But the multi-role F-4s were hard-pressed flying missions in support of beleaguered US troops fighting off the Tet Offensive. So on the 3rd of February 1968, the Barcat was provided by two F-102 Delta Daggers, the Deuces of Aerospace Defense Command. The F-102 had a troubled gestation starting way back in the 1940s. It represents an evolutionary midpoint in US interceptor development, from between the heavy but mobile radar and weapons platforms like the Black Widow to fast long-legged jets. What resulted from the extended development period was an elegant single-engine interceptor able to dash above the sound barrier while carrying up to 6 air-to-air missiles and a powerful radar. Although contemporary with the MiG-21, it fulfilled a different mission: to intercept and destroy Soviet nuclear bombers over the United States. A more reasonable comparable in the Soviet Union's Air Force would have been the Su-9. A small number of F-102s had been deployed to Southeast Asia in 1961 to counter the perceived threat of North Vietnam's Beagle light bombers. That threat never materialized, and the Deuces were put into service as bomber escorts and rudimentary all-weather interdictors to free up Phantoms and Super Sabres for ground attack missions. Although that seems like a good idea in theory, the F-102 had a good radar and long endurance when carrying drop tanks. It also looks, to the casual observer, to be a classical fighter. It's sleek, with a big delta wing. It exudes speed. But in practice, it was quite a bad idea. The F-102 was a pure-play bomber interceptor. It wasn't armed for engaging other fighters, and it wasn't a good dogfighter. Weapons-wise, the Deuce's primary armament in February 1968 was the AIM-4D Falcon. Now, the Falcon gets a horrendously bad press. It was briefly carried by the F-4D in Vietnam in lieu of the AIM-9 Sidewinder, and proved to be both hard to employ and when it was fired tended not to kill what it was aimed at. I'm not going to claim that the AIM-4 was actually a good missile, but I do think it's important to remember that the Falcon family wasn't designed to engage other fighters. It was built to engage heavy bombers from outside the range of their defensive armament. And for this reason, the Falcon lacked a proximity fuse, as the designers rightly assumed that a heavy bomber with multiple engines might shrug off shrapnel damage and continue towards its target. The Falcon also required a supply of liquid nitrogen to cool the seeker head sufficiently to detect and home in on a target. This was a critical issue in the Phantom, as the system was implemented with only 2.5 minutes supply of liquid nitrogen. This meant that the pilot had to arm the weapon, wait for the seeker to cool, which took 10 to 15 seconds, and then fire the missile within 2.5 minutes of initially hitting the arm switch. If they didn't do that, then the missile wouldn't be able to track because the seeker would no longer work, and it was therefore dead weight to carry about. This actually wasn't such a big issue on the Deuce, as it carried a larger supply of liquid nitrogen, and the Falcon was therefore a more effective weapon for the Deuce pilot than it was for the Phantom. It also had some advantages over the AIM-9B, in that it was faster, and its seeker worked over a wider angle off. Would I have wanted to swap my Sidewinder for a Falcon? No, but it isn't universally disastrous. A minor point that's worth mentioning is that by default the F-102's weapons system fired Falcons in salvos of 3. Now, I've read the aircraft manual for the Delta Dagger in some detail, and I don't believe the missiles could be fired individually, but if anybody knows for sure, then please leave me a comment. Finally, as a backup, the Deuce also carried 12 folding fin aircraft rockets, which were totally useless in a dogfight due to their inaccuracy and relatively slow velocity. Common to other US fighters of the day, the F-102 carried no internal gun. Of course, all of these weapons would be largely useless if the F-102 couldn't maneuver into an appropriate position from which to employ them. And this would be an issue. Although the Deuce has a substantially lower wing loading than the MiG-21, it was very underpowered. In essence, this means that the F-102 could execute 1 or 2 tight turns in any engagement, but would rapidly bleed airspeed and become a sitting duck. If the fight went vertical, then the F-102's lack of power put it at a severe disadvantage against the MiG-21. Nor could it disengage in the same way a Phantom could. The MiG could accelerate faster, and it had a higher top speed. Oh, and the F-102 pilot couldn't see much either, because the designers had thoughtfully put a giant metal bar in the middle of the canopy, and the engine intakes obscured the rear view. Basically, the Deuce was a liability in a dogfight, and the ADC rarely practiced for basic fighter maneuvers. Which was about to become a problem, because hidden from the 2 F-102s, Niang and Van Ko had steered their MiG-21s into position trailing them at 6 o'clock low, lighting their afterburn as they climbed towards their quarries who were still unaware of the threat. As flight leader, Niang fired first, loosing an AA-2 atoll from between 1,000 and 1,200 yards away. His intention had actually been to fire both his missiles per the typical Soviet, Chinese and VPAF doctrine, but one of the atolls just refused to launch. No matter, the second missile tracked perfectly, slamming into the trailing F-102's rear, but then failing to detonate. Seeing this, Van Ko also launched an atoll, but that failed to track. Faced with a 2-on-2 with the F-102s, the Vietnamese pilots radioed GCI and were ordered to break off the engagement. It was only at this point that Major Lomax from the 501st Air Interceptor Squadron, who was flying the lead F-102, callsign Jersey White 01, realized that they were under attack. Lieutenant Wallace Wiggins, flying on his wing, reported a sudden issue with his aircraft, and at a glance revealed a 3-meter-long missile protruding from the Deuce's rear fuselage, which was leaking prodigious amounts of fuel. Spotting the MiGs attempting to disengage, Lomax turns his F-102 and he fires a salvo of 3 IR homing AIM-4 Falcons. As was typical with the Falcon, none of them hit, which allowed the MiGs to escape, but it also bought time for Wiggins to point his crippled aircraft towards Laos. Moments later, though, Wiggins radioed to say that his aircraft was on fire and he was going to eject, but when he looked around for his wingman, all Lomax saw was a fireball and pieces of falling debris. Major Lomax circled the crash site a few times, but saw no parachute and picked up no bleeping from Wiggins' emergency locator beacon. Fearing more MiGs in the area, Lomax returned to Udorn. Wallace Wiggins was initially recorded as missing in action, a status that was changed to killed in action in 1969. His remains went unrecovered until 1978 when the Laos government returned them to the custody of the United States. He's memorialized on panel 37E, line 15 of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. I've read many accounts of this action from both sides. One thing that still puzzles me is why the Vietnamese pilots didn't press the attack from what appears to be a very advantageous position. While it's true that hit-and-run tactics were the stock in trade of the VPAF during the war, this seemed like a golden opportunity to bag 3 US aircraft with little risk. Lomax had fired his 3 AIM-4D Falcons with no result. Again, not a surprise. This left him with 3 more AIM-4s and a dozen folding fin aircraft rockets. Now, 3 AMs sounds on paper fine when defending against 2 MiGs. Unfortunately, these are AIM-4 Falcons, which means that they are almost totally useless in a dogfight with a MiG-21. Getting into a rear quarter firing position in a dogfight would have been very hard if the MiGs had pressed their attack from the 6 o'clock position, and it wasn't a given even if the MiGs had sought to re-engage from there as they were trying to egress. We can rate the chances of hitting an alert and turning MiG-21 with a folding fin aircraft rocket as 0. Essentially left the fight between 2 experienced aviators flying MiG-21s, which were faster, more agile, and still had a full complement of 30mm cannon ammunition and a single ATOL against 1 aircraft that might be able to evade them, the F-102, but was unlikely to hurt them, and the EB-66, which couldn't do either. We can strike out fuel being an issue for the MiG pilots. Neubai is about 200 kilometers from Jamnao, making it a 10 to 12 minute flight at the MiG-21's cruising speed. That left them between 5 and 10 minutes at mill power and afterburner, of which they'd used about 30 seconds. More plausible is that Nang and Van Ko were unaware that Lomax had actually fired 3 missiles at them. Although it's likely they would have detected the F-102's radar switching into a target engagement mode, they were egressing the area, and we can assume that Lomax took his shots from the rear aspect as the AIM-4D is IR homing. There's no suggestion he launched them blind, and the post-engagement assessment was that the MiGs had outrun the missiles as they retreated. Since the MiG-21 has very poor rear visibility, Nang and Van Ko may simply have not seen those 3 trails. Furthermore, they simply may have been unfamiliar with the F-102's configuration and capabilities. It was a rare sight in theatre, and although both pilots had likely studied it, it's one thing to be able to instantly recall data in class, and another to recall it at 700 miles an hour while being shot at. Performance data and the salvo-firing nature of the AIM-4 were likely unknown to the MiG pilots. If they were sensible, they would assume capabilities similar to the ATOL, comparable to the AIM-9B Sidewinder, of which it was a direct copy. But more likely, in the heat of the action, the Vietnamese flyers would have wanted to press the engagement, but they were dissuaded to do so by ground controllers 200 kilometers from the action. Ground-controlled intercept was a rigid fundamental of Soviet, Warsaw Pact and VPAF doctrine. The MiG-21 was the VPAF's premier asset, and in early 1968 they only had a handful of the supersonic fighters as the fleet had been severely battered by a UASF ruse called Operation Bolo in January 1967. In that operation, Phantoms from the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing flew the mission profile of a group of F-105 fighter bombers, drawing the VPAF into an ambush. 7 MiG-21s were shot down. Maybe the ground controllers saw a scarily familiar situation developing that afternoon in February 1968. What they believed to be an unprotected EB-66 turned out to be a pair of US fighters. Was this another ambush? 200 kilometers away, that probably looked like a big risk to take. So the doctrine of GCI dominance over autonomy for the people at the stick cost the VPAF the opportunity to deal a severe blow to the US air campaign by destroying a second priceless EB-66. But it also saved as many as 8 US lives. Doctrine kills and doctrine saves in this instance. Before I finish this one up, a few notes about the historical record. I've pieced it together from historical accounts that do vary somewhat. I've worked hard to get an accurate picture. The usually reliable Chris Hobson gets this one a little wrong in my view. In his report, Lomax and Wiggins were attacked first by 1 pair of MiG-21s, resulting in the missile sticking out of Wiggins' aircraft. As they turn for home, a second pair attack them. Lomax turns to engage them, fires his missiles, and when he looks back, Wiggins' plane is gone. Hobson also has it that the EB-66 mission was aborted and the interceptors were alone. This conflicts with all the other sources I use, but I can't find conclusive proof either way. Wayne Mutz's authoritative book on the Delta Dagger also has a couple of sentences on the shootdown. I think there's an inaccuracy there too. Mutzer writes that the F-102 was lost on an escort mission for B-52s flying against targets in North Vietnam. I don't believe that this was the case, as the official records show no B-52 missions going into North Vietnam in February 1968 at all. The location of the action also corresponds to the operating areas of EB-66s in the period. Finally, Aviation Geek Club wrote a really nice article on the shootdown from the Vietnamese point of view, but I believe it isn't completely accurate either. In their account, Major Lomax spots the MiGs approaching before they fire, he turns, he launches 3 Falcons, there's then a dogfight, Wiggins' aircraft is hit and later explodes. I don't believe that this is what happened for a couple of reasons. First, it conflicts with the timing that Lomax reported at the time. which is that Wiggins was flying straight and level when Lomax checked out his plane and saw the unexploded K-13 rocket embedded in it. Second, the after-action report says that Lomax fired 3 AIM-4Ds. This is important as the D model used an IR seeker head that could only lock onto a target from a 60-degree cone emanating from the rear. Given that there's no suggestion that Lomax had manoeuvred to gain such a position, it is highly unlikely in my view that he fired as the MiGs were closing on him. Associated with this point is that the after-action report stated that the missiles ran out of fuel, which is only possible in a tail chase as the AIM-4D had no capacity to re-engage a target it had missed through manoeuvres. Finally, I don't believe that having manoeuvred into a dominant position, the Vietnamese pilots would have chosen to break off. It would have been safer to engage with the cannon than disengage and risk giving away a rear quarter shot. Most likely they hit and ran before the F-102 pilots saw them. Another minor point is on time of day. I've inferred this from Yang and Van Ko reporting that it was their 4th flight of the day. The MiG-21 of the era was purely a day fighter, so I assume they didn't take off in darkness. Sunrise that day was 7:33 AM. The average MiG-21 mission in theatre was about 45 minutes of flight time, so probably an hour including taxi and takeoff. Assuming an hour on the ground to refuel, check the aircraft over, that means you would need about 5 hours if you were pit stopping the aircraft, meaning that it's earliest 12:30 when the flight takes off. I hope that gives you clarity about why I've told the story in this way. If you've got further information, then please leave a comment. I really appreciate them and I love to read the comments you all leave. I also hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, please do consider subscribing for more air combat tactics and strategy videos. Thanks again for watching and I'll see you again very soon.